morning, Antioch. I'm Clark Zaunbrecher, and I get to be Director of Ministry here at Antioch Brighton. I also get to be part of the Sunday afternoon Watertown Life Group. This morning, we are concluding our sermon series in 1st and 2nd Samuel, entitled What About Authority?, where we've been looking at Israel's first three kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And we've been learning specifically from how each of them responded to authority, whether it was God's authority, whether it was the authority of a leader in their lives, or whether it was the authority that God had given them. And we're also learning about God's heart, and who is God, and what are his ways. And this morning's passage, we're going to get to consider and get a glimpse of some of God's heart. And so this is the last message in our series. And not only that, but this chapter that we're looking at, 2 Samuel chapter 24, it's the last chapter of this 2-volume story about the establishing of Israel's monarchy. And this last chapter serves as kind of an epilogue, a conclusion to this 2-volume work. And so before we jump into our passage, I need to say a few things to prepare us for this journey we're about to embark on. So just the other night, I was reading a book to our 4-year-old Joshua. This one right here. Dinosaurs in the Supermarket. It's a great story. I highly recommend it for bedtime stories. Just as I was about to start reading it, Joshua asked me, "Are dinosaurs real?" And I told him, well, they used to be. They lived on Earth a long time ago, but they aren't around anymore, as far as I know. And so hearing that dinosaurs actually roamed the Earth one day, Joshua replied, "What?" Now, this is Joshua's standard response to encountering anything that is mind-blowing or anything that his brain has a hard time computing. So it's one of the cutest things he's been doing lately. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because our passage this morning, 2 Samuel 24, is definitely a what passage in my mind. So there are some incredible treasures that are in this passage, but often I think we can get distracted or stuck, or just kind of stay away from this chapter because we want to avoid all of the whats that come up along the way. So let us look at the passage, all right? 2 Samuel chapter 24. Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, "Go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and enroll the fighting men, so that I may know how many are there." But Joab replied to the king, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" The king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army's commanders. So they left the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. And after crossing the Jordan, they camped near Aroer, south of the town in the gorge. They went through Gad and on to Jazer. They went to Gilead and the region of Tatim Hadshi, and on to Dan John and around toward Sidon. Then they went toward the fortress of Tyre and all the towns of the Hivites and Canaanites. Finally, they went on to Beersheba in the Negev of Judah. So after they had gone through the entire land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel, there are 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah, 500,000. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I've done a very foolish thing." Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad the prophet, David's seer. "Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I'm giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you." So Gad went to David and said to him, "Shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me." David said to Gad, "I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands." So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the time designated. And 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, "Enough! Withdraw your hand." The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, "I have sinned, the shepherd. I have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family." On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, "Go and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad. When Araunah looked and saw the king and his officials coming toward him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" "To buy your threshing floor," David answered, "so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped." Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. Your majesty, Araunah gives all this to the king." Araunah also said to him, "May the Lord your God accept you." But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of our passage, and we're going to make a few observations as we walk through it. So this passage starts off saying that God's anger burned against Israel. So right off the bat, this could be a challenge for us. Might be a challenge for you. Does God get angry with us? Does he have a short temper? Does God have an angry disposition? I thought he was love. So here's what we know of anger. In our experience with anger in ourselves and anger with others, is that anger usually results in the object that causes the anger being rejected. Okay, so I'm angry at you, you hurt me, I reject you. Now, this may be true of 99% of the anger that we've experienced, but it's not true of God's anger. Okay, when we think about God's anger, we almost have to forget everything we think we know about anger to understand God's holy, loving anger. So James says in James 1, verse 20, he says, "For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." So righteousness means right relationship, okay? Man's anger does not bring about right relationship. It actually brings about destroyed relationships, right? So God's anger, on the other hand, does bring about right relationship. God's anger, it's love itself that provokes God to anger. It's not selfishness. It's not self-protection. It's not a personal loss. It's love that provokes God's anger. He loves his creation so fiercely that he experiences incredible displeasure when you and I set off on a path to destroy ourselves or just destroy others, which are the objects of God's love. But it's an anger that has our well-being in mind. It doesn't push us away. It draws us right back into his arms if we allow it to, okay? So important to understand God's anger. God's anger is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So God is angry, and it says that God expresses his anger by inciting David to take a census of Israel. Okay, this is one of those, what? So it appears that God is tempting David to sin. Does God tempt us to sin? Does God want us to sin so that he can punish us? If this is true, man, who has a chance of resisting sin? So there's a couple things I want us to understand to be able to digest this passage and similar passages. We got to understand the Hebrew mindset, the ancient Hebrew mindset. So whenever there is a series of events, so there's just one event and then following, there's a series of events and it leads to a certain outcome. Now, if God was the direct cause of the first event, the Hebrew mind had no problem whatsoever attributing the ultimate outcome to God. Now, one of the reasons why they were so comfortable doing this is because they were much more focused on sovereignty than they were on responsibility. And so by saying God did this, maybe God did the first event and boom, this next thing, outcome, as a way of emphasizing God's sovereignty. They say God caused that. Now they're not placing responsibility on God for doing that. Now, I'm not as comfortable as thinking that way because I am much more concerned about responsibility. I want to know who did it? Who's responsible for the sin? Was it God? Was it David? So here's another thing. Often in Scripture, we see this principle related to God's anger. When God expresses his anger, he often starts with the least severe means to bring us back to him, right? So that could be our conscience telling us, like, what you're doing is sin. It could be just a sense of just his conviction in our heart. It could be a close friend who tells us in private, like, hey, I think you're headed down a path of destruction, so on and so on and so on. Now, God is so zealous to bring us back to him and to save us from destruction that when we refuse to respond to these less severe means of correction, he'll increase it. And one of the things that he does as a last resort is he will express his displeasure by simply allowing us to move in the direction that we are kicking and screaming to move in. So he'll even allow Satan to tempt us in that direction. Now, this is clearly seen if you look at Romans chapter 1. Paul describes that as the issue of mankind, that God handed over mankind to our lusts, to the things that we are kicking and screaming to move toward. Now, sometimes the only way to bring someone back is to let them go in the direction they're wanting to go, until they find themselves stuck in a horrible situation, and with God being the only way out. And meanwhile, God is standing nearby with arms wide open, waiting for them to cry out. So again, with the help of James, we know that he says, let no one say when he's tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God can't be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. It's James 1:13. So the story is also recounted in 1 Chronicles 21, and there we see that it was actually Satan who did the tempting, not God. So God temporarily removed his hand of protection from David to allow Satan to tempt him. But David was not forced by Satan to do a census. He was merely tempted by him. It was David's sin and David that was the responsibility, that was responsible for this, for his actions. So since God was the first to move in this series of events, the writer of 2 Samuel has no issue with writing that God incited David. So David decides to go along and conduct a census of all of Israel. And not only does this seem harmless to me, like a census, like it seems like a good administrative thing to do for someone who's responsible overseeing a nation, but we get hints that there's something else going on behind the scenes, or something that we don't quite understand, because when he asks Joab, the commander of the army, to conduct the census, Joab respectfully questions David and says, why would you ask us to do such a thing? And so this is kind of a hint that this was not a normal thing. This was out of character for David. This wasn't something routine. Now, David prevails, and the census is conducted over about 10 months. And after going through all of Israel and Judah, Joab presents the results to David. And he says that there's 800,000 able-bodied men who can handle a sword in Israel. And in Judah, there's 500,000 men. Okay, 10 months later, after the census is completed, David feels convicted of what he had done, and he confesses it to the Lord. And God responds to David by saying that there will be a consequence for his sin, and he allows David to choose from 3 pretty severe options. He says 3 years of famine is one option, 3 months of a foreign army, or an army attacking their enemies, or 3 days of a plague. Now, why was the census so bad? Why was it so sinful to count the Israelites? And why are the consequences of the census so severe? Is God harsh in his personality? Does God give $5 consequences for 50-cent offenses? Let's look at the census first. So, as you know, Israel had a special relationship with God. God had chosen them to be the nation through which he would reverse the curse of the fall in Genesis 2, and he would bless and reconcile all the other nations to himself through them. And their part was to remain set apart to God, worship him and trust him only, and not take up the destructive practices of the nations that were all around them. So this meant trusting and relying on him and him alone, not relying on themselves or other nations or the detestable gods that the nations trusted in. Now, David knew this, and he was committed to it. And his worship in the book of Psalms is full of declarations, as we have here in Psalm chapter 20, verse 6 through 7. David says, "Now this I know, the Lord gives victory to his anointed. He answers him from his heavenly sanctuary with victorious power of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." So other nations, the nations all around Israel, they trusted in the size and the strength of their armies, but not Israel. Israel trusted in the goodness of their God, his faithfulness and his love. And this was their testimony to the rest of the world of how good it is to be under a God so loving, to be under his leadership, as loving as Yahweh's leadership. So David, however, for some reason, he had drifted into a posture of self-reliance. Now, instead of trusting in the name of the Lord, his God, as he had done so in the past, he trusted in his chariots and horses, or in other words, his armies. Now, the sin of counting his military strength was committed in front of the whole nation, in front of millions. And he was in essence declaring from his place of authority to the whole nation that their strength came from the size of their army, not from God. David's sin would in turn embolden the nation to move into the direction they were already prone to move in, the direction of self-reliance. And a self-reliant chosen people would be utterly useless in God's plan to draw the nations to himself and bless the nations. Okay, so now let's look at the seeming harshness of God's response. So when our kids we've got 4 of them, and when they were around the 2 or 5 age range, I can't think of any acts of disobedience that were met with more severe disciplinary consequences than when they chose to run out into the street without mom or dad, right? So undoubtedly, I imagine from the child's point of view, they would wonder, what is the big deal? Why such a severe response to me walking a mere 5 feet in front of my curb? What the child doesn't realize is that the consequence of us not disciplining them when they walk into the street is much, much more severe than the actual discipline itself. So death is a more severe consequence than mom and dad's momentary discipline. Now God, who has all wisdom and has an eternal perspective, he understands that the consequences of unchecked sin are far more severe than his discipline. This is why when we observe or experience God's discipline in our own lives, or observe it in the scripture or in other people's lives, we don't kick against it and we don't stand in judgment over it. Instead, what we do is we do what we're exhorted to do in Hebrews 12. We submit to the Father of our spirits and we live. So being offered three choices, David chooses the consequence that will come directly from God's hand. They had recently experienced a 3-year famine in chapter 21, and it was too soon. No, we don't want to do a 3-year famine. And then David didn't want to be pursued by his enemies because he knew what was in the heart of man. He wanted to be at the mercy of God, not the mercy of man. So God releases a 3-day plague on Israel. And 70,000 people die. It's horrible. David cries out to God, and God tells David to build an altar of sacrifice on the threshing floor of this guy named Araunah. Araunah says, hey man, it's all yours. Take it. Do what you got to do. But David says, no way. I am not going to offer a sacrifice to God that cost me nothing. So David builds an altar. He makes a sacrifice. We see in verse 16 that when God beheld the destruction done to Israel, and he sees David's brokenness over the sin, God cries out, enough! And David finds mercy. And it seems there are hints in this passage that the plague was cut short, maybe hours before the 3-day completion. But David found mercy. Now, why is this chapter the last story in this 2-volume epic? And just a couple chapters earlier, we read David's last words. And so it's like, okay, story's over. But then there's this other story. So why is this the conclusion of his work? I think it's placed here at the end for a couple of reasons. One is that this story brings together a number of the major insights and themes that we see in these 2 books. They're the major insights and themes that we've seen over the course of this sermon series. And by bringing them all together, it kind of provides a summary, a reminder, a review of what we learned. So the author gives us one last look at this man whom God referred to in 1 Samuel 13 as the man after my own heart, David. So David was indeed, he was a man after God's heart. But like every single one of us, this heart for God was wrapped in a sheath of weak, sin-prone flesh. And we see that in this story, and also in all the other stories, that sin has devastating consequences. And the greater the authority that God has given you, the farther the ripples of those consequences go. Now, David is among many in this 2-volume story who commit horrible, destructive sins. But what causes David to shine forth through the ugly mess and be the one who's known as the one with a heart after God's heart, is that David's heart was always broken over his brokenness. And every time, God responded to his broken heart with open arms of mercy. So Antioch, Brighton, may we do the same when we encounter the brokenness in our lives. May we respond with broken hearts and run into the arms of God. Bless you.